I just watched last night the new Marilyn Monroe film, which I'm not going to call a biopic. And if I do use the term biopic in this review, I apologize because this is not a biopic and we'll go into why. But yeah, I just watched the new Marilyn Monroe flick and I am very, very, very impressed by it. As I was walking out of the cinema, I was talking about it with a friend, and my friend said it has a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, which made my jaw drop. I feel like I watched a completely different film compared to everyone else. I want to go through some of those criticisms people have. I want to tell you guys why I like the movie, and I want to talk about why I think this is one of the best movies of the year, and you should see this on the big screen. I don't think Netflix watching it in your living room with all your distractions is going to do it any justice. Before talking about the movie, let's talk about a few controversies. This movie had a lot of controversies going into it. The first controversy being that Ana de Armas was playing Marilyn Monroe, and she doesn't really have an American accent. At least at the time, people didn't know her to have an American accent. That was kind of debunked while I watched this movie. I didn't even detect any of the Spanish accent in her. Maybe like a few moments, especially when there's scenes of high energy, her Spanish accent kind of slips through the cracks. But I didn't really care. When it comes to things like this is another controversy that's going on with the Woman King. I don't really care about historical accuracy. If you're going into movies for historical accuracy, you're going into movies for the wrong reason. Watch a documentary, read a book. Movies are supposed to entertain. I just reviewed The Fablemans on my channel, and Steven Spielberg understood that. Movies are supposed to be entertaining first. You're supposed to go through a change of emotion while watching the movie, and then you can worry about the historical accuracies later. So as long as you tell a compelling story with a good narrative, that's all what matters. To me anyway. It might be different for you guys, but I don't watch like the Elvis movie to get like all the beats of the Elvis story, or I don't watch this movie hoping to get the beats of everything that went through the life of Marilyn Monroe, which is why I don't call this a biopic, because if you're going in expecting that, you're not gonna get it. So following that controversy, you had a standing ovation at the Venice Film Festival that lasted 14 minutes. That doesn't mean shit. The Venice Film Festival, people will walk out at the strangest movies. You can show The Godfather, half the room's gonna give a 30-minute standing ovation, half the room's gonna walk out. I don't know what people are fucking smoking in Venice, but it gives you a lot of emotions apparently. There's never an in-between at Venice, which is why I like the Italian people. They're very high emotion. But then critics started complaining about how this changes the life of Marilyn Monroe in certain regards. A lot of it is accurate, a lot of it is fictionalized. It's kind of hard as a viewer, especially a viewer who's not really into Marilyn Monroe compared to most people. It's kind of hard for me to understand where the lines are being crossed and what's fiction and what's not fiction. But again, that falls into that category. It's like, give me a good movie and then I'll look up the details myself. I don't really care. Yeah, people are claiming that this movie kind of tarnishes the legacy of Marilyn Monroe, which I would disagree. If anything, it gave me much more respect for Marilyn Monroe. So this movie opens with Marilyn Monroe as a child, the traumatic events that happened in her childhood, her mom being mentally ill, and her father kind of leaving her at a very young age, and she doesn't know who her father is. So it's about Marilyn Monroe not getting affection when she was young, and then she goes out into Hollywood, into this position where she thinks she's going to get a lot of affection, but ends up being exploited. People use her vulnerability as a way to exploit this actress. On a technical level, this film is amazing, and I don't think anyone's denying that. The cinematography is fucking beautiful. The shot composition, the uses of different aspect ratios, the use of music. Guys, if this doesn't get nominated for best score, I don't know what a better score. The music was done by Nick Cave, by the way, and this is a fucking amazing score. And there's points in the score where when like Marilyn Monroe's life takes a turn for the worse, you'll have this strange sounds of and they just changed the key of the music, and it was very brilliantly done. It sounds like pretentious when I describe it, but it works so well in the movie. And of course, Ana de Armas's performance, which has her go through a lot of difficult situations. People are wondering, why did they go with Ana de Armas? The problem is Ana de Armas has that big, larger than life kind of performance and persona about her, and she's like kind of the hot thing right now. And meanwhile, if you were to get something like a Scarlett Johansson, I don't know if she would agree to do everything in this movie. So you're kind of riding a fine line between trying to find an actress who's larger than life in the sense of Marilyn Monroe and not too big, because a lot of this film deals with very dark subject matter, and I don't think an actress would want to put herself through that and kind of change her audience's perspective on her. And I think Ana de Armas works perfectly well in this movie. I can see some people having a problem with an accent, but again, that doesn't bother me because I understand that movies aren't real life depictions. But she's not the only good person in this movie. Adrian Brody, who plays Arthur Miller, is great in this movie. You have Bobby Cannavale, who plays Joe DiMaggio in this movie. He works perfectly well. So this movie is kind of told through a series of vignettes about different things that happen in the life of Marilyn Monroe. And it deals with the theme of exploitation. And every vignette you get kind of shows a different reason for the characters to exploit Marilyn Monroe. This is almost not about Marilyn Monroe, more than it is about the people who exploited Marilyn Monroe. So you kind of start off with Charlie Chaplin Jr., and he exploits Marilyn Monroe along with another famous actor's son. I forget which one. But you have Charlie Chaplin Jr., who complains that his father is a deadbeat dad. And he uses Marilyn Monroe as kind of an indirect way to get back at his father, because Marilyn Monroe represents Hollywood, and Charlie Chaplin was probably too busy with Hollywood to take care of his son. So he kind of uses Marilyn Monroe as a way to get back at his father. Then you have Arthur Miller, who seems more compassionate, seems more reasoning than past lovers that Marilyn Monroe had, but she finds out that he's exploiting her for his art, which makes her feel a different way. That's what I mean. This movie is about exploitation. And of course, you have producers who exploit her for her sexuality and her stardom and her ability to make money. The movie even goes one step further and questions how responsible are we, the audience, who is currently watching this Marilyn Monroe film, how responsible are we in the exploitation of Marilyn Monroe? And how responsible are the consumers of Marilyn Monroe media when it comes to her exploitation? Which is why I feel like this movie has a more horrifying angle more than a biopic. I was just watching Kermo's review of this movie, where he compares it to Repulsion, the Polanski movie, and that's like an apt analogy. This is not a biopic. If you go into this thing like wanting to see like the best moments of Marilyn Monroe's life, you're not going to get it. This is more so a horror movie. Even when it comes down to the cinematography and the music, that's like music you would see in an A24 horror movie rather than a Marilyn Monroe biopic. And for that reason, I feel like it was a very relevant story to today's time, where we are starting to have discussions about exploiting women in media, and it's done through the life of Marilyn Monroe. And I feel like the 3-hour runtime was necessary for that movie, because you're going through every different type of exploitation that this woman had to suffer through, and kind of diagnosing why are people exploiting her. Some people are exploiting her unintentionally. Arthur Miller wasn't intentionally exploiting her, but he probably ended up contributing to the scars that were left on Marilyn Monroe. Sure, Marilyn Monroe had some great accomplishments in her life, and it wasn't all like sad and doom and gloom in her life, but this movie is about the doom and gloom. So why are critics bashing this movie? I kind of watched a lot of critics before doing my review when I found out that I'm giving this a 9 out of 10 and other people are giving it a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. So I decided to go through a bunch of reviews. A lot of people complained about the runtime. Runtime was not a problem to me. The 3 hours, I barely felt it go by. I didn't feel the need to check the time on my phone. Actually, as a true testament to how immersive this movie is, I fucking scratched the shit out of my car prior to going into the theater. Like, on my way to the theater, I was in a parking lot, and I scratched the shit out of my fucking car. Luckily, I didn't scratch it against another car. It was just against a column. But I was, like, fucking pissed. And as soon as this movie started, about 15 minutes in, I forgot about it. And then, unfortunately, when I walked out of the theater and saw my car again, I was like, oh, fuck, I have to deal with this shit again. But anyway, yeah, I didn't feel the time go by is what I'm saying. People are complaining about the historical inaccuracies, especially when it comes to people like Joe DiMaggio, who was abusive but had reconciled with Marilyn Monroe before her death and became a fan of hers. Which I understand. They didn't show the scene in which the two got divorced and reconciled. I understand that. But regardless, this movie is about the scars that were left on Marilyn Monroe. I feel like if you try to throw that scene in, it's kind of pointless. I feel like there was still some trauma that was left in the life of Marilyn Monroe from that abusive relationship. So to have like, oh, all is forgiven, whatever, it kind of doesn't fit in the movie because we know that those kind of scars don't really go away. People are complaining that Arthur Miller divorced Marilyn Monroe because of infidelity, but who's to say that she didn't act infidel because of his behavior towards her? Which is another thing too. This movie kind of acts like a fever dream, similar to the Elvis movie that came out earlier this summer. You're kind of jumping from one location to the other, and sometimes a character kind of just gets dropped or left in the background in order to make room for something else, because this character is addicted to drugs, and that's how the rush of drugs makes you feel. So there are some loose ends in this movie. Not everything is going to be tied neatly in a bow. I think a lot of people are also upset that this tarnishes the legacy of certain people in Hollywood. Charlie Chaplin, for one, who's portrayed as a deadbeat dad. Marilyn Monroe, who's kind of portrayed as this broken figure. But I think showing the darker side of the past Hollywood is an important thing to acknowledge in order to learn from. And at no point in this movie did I think this movie was woke or preachy or anything. I felt it was kind of true and gritty and very in your face. There is a cameo, if you want to call it that, or a significant figure in the life of Marilyn Monroe that you wouldn't expect a movie to play with. And this movie kind of goes there. And I feel like it was necessary to have that scene. I'm going to spoil who that cameo is. I'm sure you guys have probably heard it by now. But if you don't want to hear a spoiler to who that is, JFK is in this movie, and when Marilyn Monroe meets him, he kind of abuses her as well. Which some people might take issue with because the JFK and Marilyn Monroe relationship was legitimate. She's saying, "Happy birthday, Mr. President." It didn't seem like something that was dreadful to Marilyn Monroe. But I think that's where you do the fourth wall break in the movie, where you're an audience and you're coming here to see Marilyn Monroe and JFK and their personal relationship, and we're kind of being exploitative ourselves as viewers of this movie. We're coming to see this very private matter that's very public to everyone. Some people are complaining that the movie is exploitative while trying to teach about exploitation, but I feel like you kind of have to go into those dirty areas in order to paint a picture of what's going on. And this isn't a situation like Cuties where you're riding a fine line because you're dealing with kids and kids can't really consent. Everyone involved in this movie was consenting. They knew that they're doing this for the greater purpose of sending a message and telling a narrative. So everyone was fine. People were complaining that Ana de Armas was kind of showing her tits too often in the movie. Grow up, it's just a pair of tits. Who gives a shit? What else can you say? Like there's some scenes where yes, she is being sexualized and that's the point of the movie. And then there's other scenes it's like, okay, she's getting out of bed and we see her tits. It's like, girl, I feel like people are a little immature when it comes to boobies. And I feel like the other thing this movie does is it reminded me of the Joker debate, where if you guys remember, when the Joker movie came out, every critic hated it. They gave it a 50%, and they used similar criticisms that it was exploitive. What I think this movie does, that the Joker movie does, is that the Joker movie holds a mirror to the audience and asks the audience, how responsible are we as a society for creating Jokers? For creating mentally ill people who go crazy and do these outrageous things that are inconceivable to us. This movie does the same thing. It holds a mirror to the audience and says, how responsible are we for the exploitation of young actresses? Not even necessarily Marilyn Monroe, but young actresses. Because we consume the media, we're kind of feeding into that vicious circle. And sometimes that mirror is just way too bright. Sometimes that mirror is just way too clear that it's going to repulse some people. It's going to make some people back off from it. But me as a viewer, I think that's the power of film, is to hold a mirror to society and be like, how responsible are we for this? And it made me wonder too, what kind of world do we live in where movies like Elvis, which I thought was terrible, and Thor: Love and Thunder, those are movies that are getting more praise by critics than this movie that's obviously trying to send a message. One other thing I saw a lot is people comparing this movie to The Passion of the Christ, where if you guys remember The Passion of the Christ, there's like very brutal gore scenes going on because they're trying to show Jesus in his last moments getting tortured. And people thought that Passion of the Christ was pretty exploitative. Me too, to a certain extent. I think Passion of the Christ is a very flawed movie, and it is somewhat exploitative of the crucifixion of Jesus. But I think a more apt analogy is actually The Last Temptation of Christ. It's very hard for an audience member to relate to someone who's man in God because we don't understand what that feels like. So The Last Temptation of the Christ said, okay, let's make him all human and not so much God in order for the audience to relate to Jesus and understand why the passion of Jesus was such a big monumental thing. This movie kind of does the same thing with Marilyn Monroe. It takes the life of Marilyn Monroe, who's this giant starlet, who's a larger-than-life cultural touchstone, and makes you think of all of the thousands of women who probably went through similar beats in their lives to Marilyn Monroe. We always hear about women who've had rough upbringings who go to Hollywood in order to escape and become a name and end up being exploited. And then the movie makes you wonder, we're having this debate going on. Did this actually happen to Marilyn Monroe? Did this not actually happen to Marilyn Monroe? And to me, I'm like, it doesn't matter because thousands of people are going through this thing. It just so happened that the subject of this movie is Marilyn Monroe because that's who we identify as a starlet in our mind. And if we're so passionate about whether this really happened to Marilyn Monroe or not, why are we not passionate about it happening to all the thousands of women in Hollywood? I think that's where the movie really gets intelligent to me. Am I diving too deep into it? Maybe. I just fucking like the movie. Fuck off, people. 9 out of 10. Alright, I'll see you guys around.